Welcome back. Today we are excited to have Stephanie Acosta, a content director at UWorld, which has acquired Themis Bar Review, joining us to talk more about what these commercial bar prep providers do to create all of the content to help you study for the bar. We would like to thank Themis Bar Review and UWorld for sponsoring this. If you're a 3L, you're nearing the law school finish line and gearing up for the next big step, becoming a licensed attorney. That's why I'm excited to share an exclusive promotion from Themis Bar Review designed especially for those preparing for the 2025 bar exam. Save $700 on any July 2025 Themis Bar Review course using the code BAREXAMTB700 at checkout. That's BAREXAMTB700, now valid through April 1st, 2025. Don't miss out on this opportunity. Start your bar prep journey with Themis today. So Stephanie, thank you for taking time this morning and joining us. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
So to get things kicked off, can you share a little bit more about yourself and what led to you working for UWorld and Themis to support bar takers?
Yeah, so Themis Bar Review is, the commercial bar prep company that I think we all know and are familiar with. And so I became a part of the Themis Bar Review family by way of the UWorld acquisition of Themis back in 2020, which was just right before the pandemic. And so that was fun. I was actually the founding member of the legal education vertical at UWorld back in 2017. And that was a really unexpected opportunity that was presented to me by way of my sister volunteering me to meet with the UWorld CEO. So my sister's actually the head of content development for UWorld's medical education products. And so around the time when UWorld wanted to move past medical education and be involved with helping students prepare for other high stakes exams, the bar exam came up and my sister said, hey, Stephanie's an attorney, go talk to her. So that's how it happened. I volunteered. Yeah. So when I met with our CEO, Dr. Chandra Pemasani, what prompted me to make the very unexpected career change was an opportunity to work in bar review, but for a company that had not been involved in legal education at all, which meant that there was no preconceived notion as to how law should be taught and what a bar prep company and how our materials should look. And so that gave me the opportunity to be really creative and really innovative with truly one goal, which was that I had to make a product that was going to be number one on the market. And so if he was going to hire me to make the product, I needed to make it the best product out there. So no pressure, but his just unwavering commitment to wanting a top of the line product, to wanting to have the best content, no matter the cost, was really an exciting and unexpected opportunity. And it's been great that he has remained so true to that commitment. And that's kind of the story that runs through all of the UWorld family and also into Themis Bar Review.
Yeah, I think a lot of people don't realize that UWorld, although it feels like they're newer to the bar scene, has been in test prep for a long time.
Yes. So as I had noted, they started out with the medical exam, the medical licensing exam. And that's a really cute story where it was Chandra Pemasani, our CEO, who was just kind of creating these practice questions during his residency and partnered up with his brother and his brother's roommate at the time to make it an online study tool. And it just took off from there. And so it's been really interesting to come from a company like UWorld, who has its foundation in medical education, but find ways in which a lot of those teaching principles do create opportunities and overlap with the legal education realm. And then certainly it's really fun to have all of the experience and knowledge of Themis Bar Review to join forces with us to create just what I think is a really great product that we're all excited about. And we've had the opportunity to make some really, really cool content enhancements these past 5 years.
Great. And so did you go straight from law school into working in bar prep, or did you take a break and practice law for a bit?
I did practice law for a bit. I actually had my dream job. I got to work at an appellate law firm when I graduated law school. So I'm a moot court nerd. So I did moot court in law school, and I actually still coach for my alma mater. So when I had the opportunity to go right into an appellate law firm, I just thought, this is amazing. All I want to do is wear pajamas, read records, and write appellate briefs. That's amazing. So yeah, I really wasn't looking at bar prep at all. But because of my experience in the appellate world, when I got the opportunity to develop a bar prep product, what was really cool is that a lot of the changes in legal writing that were happening in the appellate field were super applicable to what we needed to do with our bar review content. So, for example, in the appellate law practice, that's where we were really thinking about making sure that we're writing in simplistic language and avoiding legalese. There was a movement towards using more simplistic sentences. We were really cognizant of the fact that judges weren't reading briefs on paper anymore. We submit them electronically. They're reading them on their laptops, on their iPads. And so when we're dealing with an on-screen reader, they're processing this content and this information differently. And that translates perfectly to what we're seeing with our bar prep students and our law students as well. They're reading textbooks online more so than ever. They're digesting the majority of their bar review content through a digital platform. And with NextGen, that'll be 100% digital, right? Everything will be online. And so it allowed us to take a lot of those writing strategies that kept judges engaged in what it is we were writing in appellate briefs and apply it to the bar review format. So that's why in UWorld and now in Themis, you see us using those shorter sentences. You see us using bullet points in our writing, short paragraphs, strategic bolding, and different things like that to just keep our students engaged and focused on what we're saying.
Yeah. The real question is, will NextGen adopt the whiteboard like California has for its online exam with all the debate about what pens are allowed? And I feel like I'm going to order a bunch of pens on Amazon and test them out so I can tell my students what whiteboard pens I think we should recommend. I mean, hopefully it won't be that weird.
Oh, goodness. And I'm kind of jealous that the California students get a whiteboard. I mean, maybe that's just me, but the ability
I don't
to
know everyone's excited about the whiteboard. I'll be honest.
Good. I think it's not just me. I mean, how amazing to just wipe and go and just...
Yeah. But then think the logistics, you can accidentally erase with your hand. That's the part that would get me. Like, you really have to practice writing on it a little bit. I don't know. It's going to be a thing. We'll see how it all goes. But I think it's pretty anxiety inducing at this point to be the first group to use the whiteboard. So we'll see.
If that happens, I'm really hoping that we make Themis branded whiteboards that we can pass out to our students, because I want one for myself. Yeah. Yeah.
I know. I know. All right. So let's talk about content, right? Because a lot of, what a bar provider is the presentation of content. So how do you create these products to help people study for the bar exams? I think most of our listeners have never thought about how a bar provider develops content. Some of that content is licensed from the bar exams and provided, but a lot of it is not. So how do you all do that piece?
Yeah. So as your question, subtly implied, is when we're looking at bar review content, we're looking at two different things. One thing is the practice questions, which is when we're developing that content, we want it to look as close to the actual exam as possible, which is why any question that we're able to license, we want to license it and make sure that our students get to see that. But also when we're expanding upon the pool of questions that students can use to practice with, we are going to scrutinize those license questions and make sure that what we're writing fits seamlessly with the style, writing, language use that the examiners are using themselves. The other side of content development is all of the supporting materials that help you learn the law and lawyering skills and exam taking skills that are going to be needed to successfully answer those questions that you're going to see on exam day. And with those materials, that's where we're really trying to think about, okay, how do we meet our students where they're at? What do we do with our materials to ensure that they're understandable, easily digestible, and students are able to retain what it is that we're teaching them? And one way I think UWorld has really made a name for itself in this area is through the use of images in our MBEQ bank and having those images in the explanations. And that's a strategy that we're pulling more and more through the Themis Bar Review product, where we have these really great visuals to accompany our lectures now. And actually come summer, this coming summer, we're going to start having a lot of that imagery show up in some of our outlines too. And so I'm really excited to see the student responses there. But when we're talking about images, I think it's really easy to think like, oh, it's just a picture. But really, when I'm talking about images, I'm thinking of something that's much broader than that. And goes from something that's as simple as a table that can show a compare and contrast of different terminologies or lay out the elements of a cause of action in a different way. Or we can go to a flow chart that shows a thought process for legal analyses, or how the Fifth Amendment connects to the Sixth Amendment, a chain of title and timelines for real property. And even something like when we think of an image, it's a full blown illustration. And it stems because UWorld started out in medical education where images just are such a logical connection. Of course, you need to know what skin cancer looks like, for example. Of course, you need to be able to read an x-ray. And so the incorporation of images in that product is really logical. And so when I started the MBEQ Bank, I had a whole team of medical illustrators and graphic designers at my disposal. It was like, well, I mean, why not give it a try and see how we can do that in legal education as well? And the students' response to that has just been awesome. And it's been so nice to see that as they're starting to digest content and learn through images and be visual learners more and more and more, that we've been able to do our best to evolve our materials and keep up with them so that we can teach them these concepts in a way that resonates with them.
I do think that that's one of the biggest comments I get when I encourage folks to test out their bar review options, especially for things like the multiple choice. That is one of the pieces of feedback I get, is that some folks are very taken by the images. And I think if you are a more visual person, that's something that will really, resonate with you, especially if you're not the type of person that wants to create any of your own imagery. You want to borrow images from someone else.
Yeah. Yeah. And sometimes it's just a nice way to have a little bit of fun in what can sometimes feel a bit monotonous and dry with your materials. I'm thinking we have an image that one of my content developers created that I just wasn't really sure about, but it came from an MBE question where there's the leader at a circus who, sicks a tiger on somebody. And it's, well, could there be a battery? Because the circus leader didn't actually touch the plaintiff in that case. And so it's like, I'm going to create an image where there's a tiger and a circus guy. And I'm showing how there can be different types of contact in a battery action. And I thought, hey, that's pretty cool. And it's actually really wonderful to see how many student comments we get just from that one image that I thought, that's a bit silly. I'm not sure how difficult of a concept it is, but that, hey, it made them laugh. It was a great way for them to remember this principle when it comes to battery. And while that might have been a simple multiple choice question, then they remembered to spot that issue when they were going and tackling an essay. And so it's been really fun to learn about the power of images in our memory and as a teaching tool and that sort of thing.
Yeah. All right, let's talk about what's coming down the pipe for the bar exam. So changes are coming. We already referenced that changes exist right now for California, but we're not going to spend a bunch of time on that because it stresses everybody out. But for those of you who don't know, outside of California, California is launching its own virtual bar exam for the first time in February 2025. So stay tuned to this podcast if you want to hear more about it, because we'll be talking about it a lot and have been talking about it a lot. But the next gen bar exam is really, I think, what is the major change that is coming around the country, and jurisdictions have been adopting it kind of as it's part of its rolling out. So it's not everybody's going to adopt it in 2026. There still is not a lot of information out there. They have not released everything that they said they were going to release. And so there's still a lot of open questions, but we have students in law school right now who are going to end up sitting for this next gen exam. So what is UWorld and Themis doing to position itself to help students prepare for the next gen?
Yeah. I love that question. We're doing a lot. And what I will say is this. At Themis Bar Review, we have the largest, most experienced team of full-time content developers of any bar review company. And I will say that while for students who are currently in law school and who are looking at taking the bar exam in the next few years, the uncertainty surrounding next gen can feel really scary. And I'm really sympathetic to that. But for those of us who are in the bar review industry, this isn't new to us. I mean, Lee, as you mentioned in California, we just had to adapt to the changes that we learned about for this coming February California exam with, less than 6 months notice. And we're able to do that. With the Florida bar exam, Florida is really special in that they like to roll out changes in the law, even just a week before the exam and test students on it. And we adapt our materials accordingly. So I know that when students are sitting here trying to figure out, okay, well, is my jurisdiction going next gen or not? Or, hey, I know my jurisdiction's going next gen and I still feel like I don't know everything. We get it. But the good news is that we're really experienced when it comes to developing bar prep products. And so from the moment we heard about next gen, before we ever saw any sample questions from the NCBE, we said, you know what? We're going to start creating this kind of content. And so take the integrated question sets, for example, which is a really new testing concept for those of us in legal education. We kind of heard the goals that the NCBE was trying to achieve with this new item type and immediately got to work drafting our own questions. And what was so cool, what I think really tells the story of our experience is that when we finally saw a sample integrated question set from the NCBE, man, we were pretty darn close with what we had created. And so we were able to look at that sample and make some really minor tweaks, and we've moved forward with that content development. So I know a lot of people in legal education and a lot of your listeners and law students are feeling a bit of anxiety, and that's super normal when we're dealing with something new. But trust in the experience that your legal educators, your teachers, your academic support personnel, and bar review providers are bringing to the table. Because while this is a new experience for you, I promise we've got this and we're going to keep you prepared. I also want to say, I think we have a tendency to focus on things that are different. And sometimes we forget just how much is actually staying the same with the next gen exam. And so if we look at multiple choice questions, for example, there's some really minor stylistic changes between the current MBE questions and what we're going to see on next gen, but nothing that should derail students, even those who are used to seeing a standard MBE question. We're going from a 90-minute MPT to now something about 60 minutes. It's the exact same skill set. It looks largely the same. It's just a shortened time span. And so those are things that shouldn't alarm students. And ultimately, the bar exam is still just a baseline understanding of legal skills and legal knowledge, right? And the subject matter outlines aren't changing all that much. In fact, you're going to have to learn less. And so I think there are a lot of positive things that should reduce student anxiety as they're confronting these new challenges.
Yeah. So for jurisdictions that are not, adopting next gen right away or haven't come out whether or not they will adopt it, you mentioned earlier that you've seen stylistically that the bar is kind of shifted in the same way that you saw your appellate work shifting. This real focus on short and concise sentences, concise rule statements. I think I'm adding that one to what you were talking about, but that you are really trying to be as efficient as possible in your writing. So what other things have you seen in the bar exam, both with the multiple choice and the essays, that you think has changed over the last few years? And has it changed how we ask students to prepare for it?
Not really. I mean, at the end of the day, we've been teaching IRAC in legal education forever, right?
Yeah.
And so this process of legal writing isn't becoming fundamentally different. And if anything, I think students are being encouraged to write more how they would speak. And I think that lends itself to helping students succeed even more so on the exam. We're talking about changes and multiple choice questions, but at the end of the day, multiple choice questions are still teaching on your ability to issue spot and on your ability to conduct a legal analysis and reach a logical conclusion. And so I think when we're looking at changes in the bar exam, one thing that does feel a bit reassuring and the tumultuous times, starting with COVID, next gen, California, is that there are still a lot of things that are remaining consistent. But one thing that I'm really excited about is to see more of these lawyering skills, which I think is what your question is getting at, start to be tested in the bar review realm. And so I think it's been great that, like the MPT seems to have always really resonated with the legal community as a fair assessment of what a newly licensed attorney should be able to achieve in a law firm. So it's exciting to see that continue into the next gen exam. And it's really cool to see that we're going to have lawyering skills like client counseling and with integrated question sets, being able to see sample documents and have questions that are related to those kinds of readings and being part of the bar exam as well. And that's just showing how the bar exam in law school in general is being reflective of what we're doing in actual legal practice. So it's not as though law school is now just based on learning legal doctrine. There's really been an emphasis on learning these lawyering skills. So we see, ADR becoming a lot more popular, and there's a lot more competitions for court, going back to that one, mock trial, client counseling, alternative dispute resolution, negotiations, and then also even more, clinics and things like that are giving students real world legal experiences. And so I'm really excited to see that show up more so on the exam and to have questions that are placing students in the role of the attorney. I think that actually is going to feel like a much more logical testing process and a more natural testing process than what we're seeing with the current bar exam today.
Great. So what are some common mistakes that you think students make when they're engaging with Themis as their bar review provider or UWorld as their MBE practice?
Yeah, so the low-hanging fruit answer there is you have to use the materials and get through them. That's obvious. And I think the less obvious answers and what I would love to see students do more of is to invest more time in self-assessment and also utilize their known study strategies. So turning to self-assessments first, what I mean by that is there really is a difference in answering quickly 200 questions and moving on versus answering 100 questions and going through to see if you understand why did I get it right and did I actually understand why every alternative answer choice was wrong, right? There's a big difference in writing answers to 5 essays versus writing out 3 essays and actually going through the outlines and the sample answers provided and seeing, was your writing clear and concise? Did I use IRAC? Did I spot all of the issues? Are they presented in a logical way? How could I have improved upon what I did? And there's a lot of known power in taking that time to do self-assessment and taking ownership over not just going through the practice, but synthesizing the results that is really going to elevate your studying. And then moving to study strategies, I think that there's a big tendency for law students to doubt themselves in what it is they should be doing when it comes to studying for the bar exam. But by the time we're studying, we should all be pros at knowing what it is we need to do to succeed on a test. And so, we'll see students who say, yeah, I just spent 4 hours trying to read the long outline and I can't remember a single thing. Well, okay, did you just read and remember and succeed in law school? Or did you make your own flashcards? Did you find a way to summarize what you were reading into textbooks into, a condensed outline in some way? What did you do there so that you were prepared for your final exam? Because those are the exact same things that you should be doing when it comes to bar review. So while my job is to give you as many tools as possible to study, I want to give my visual learners a lecture to look at, or my auditory learners something to listen to. I want to give my visual learners pictures and text to read. My active learners or kinetic learners, the ability to make their own flashcards or make their own outlines. But it's really up to the individual student to know what study strategies work best for them and apply that to the tools and use the tools effectively in how we've been given and how we have given them in bar review.
Yeah, I think what can be tricky for some students is that there are some law schools who are really leaning heavily into the open book exams for these core 1L classes. And I've always been pretty critical of that. Not that anybody cares what I think. No law school dean cares what I think, but I still talk about it because it's my podcast. But I don't think that does a service when the licensing exam still requires a lot of memorization. And I do think that some students get to the bar and they are not well versed in memorizing material. They may be able to outline, they may be able to reference, but that they are not used to that heavy level of memorization. And so I know for my students, I do go back to this idea that you have to be constantly giving yourself assessments to see if the time that you're putting in has a return on investment. And so if you're making flashcards, I made this mistake when I was studying for the bar. I hate flashcards. I don't know why I thought I had to make flashcards for the bar. That was like a terrible choice. I made them and then didn't use them and then realized that I was just wasting time because that was not how, and I had closed book exams in law school. I did have an idea of how to do them, but I still wasted a bunch of time because everybody was making flashcards. And I thought that was like what you were supposed to do. So the way that you find out that whether or not that is something you're supposed to do is to study it and then do questions. And if you don't know the law, then that's not the way you should be studying. So you can, even if you don't have a lot of experience memorizing huge, massive amounts of law in law school, by being very honest with yourself and doing those testing assessments throughout, you're going to get that information. I think one of the challenges is it feels really crummy to do that. Nobody enjoys testing themselves in that way because it makes you feel uncomfortable. It's highlighting where your weak areas are. It can be hard on your mental state. You have to really be in a growth mindset. But if you don't do that, you're not getting any feedback about whether the time you're putting in is useful or not. And I think that is hard. If your law school didn't train you in that, then you need to make sure that assessment piece is even more critical during your bar prep.
Yeah, I think thank goodness that we have practice questions when it comes to bar prep, right? I mean, back in my day in law school, it was you never saw how the professor examined you until you showed up for your final. And so having the practice questions at your disposal is really great and really useful. What I will say is even with an open book exam, and I share your views in that regard. Because even as practicing attorneys, you're still expected to be able to issue spot. And so you have to have some level of general familiarity with the law to represent your client and to think through the story that they're telling them and think of ways in which you can solve that problem. And so I think it is important to have a baseline knowledge of, memory retention. But what I will say is this, you're never going to pass a final exam if you're relying on a book to read through the materials and understand them for the first time. So even if you are not focused on rote memorization for your final exam, you are still involved in that learning process. And so if you learn best by reading through the cases and going through the process of outlining and synthesizing on your own, then do that when you're reading the long outline in bar review. If you learn best by recording your law professor, if they let you, and listening to that audio on repeat, then hey, do the same thing when you're listening to a video lecture in bar review. I think there's still a lot of things that you can take from your academic experiences that will be applicable to your studying when it comes to a bar exam.
So what advice would you give to a bar taker who is frustrated with the process and gets stuck? So this happens to almost every bar taker. I don't know if it happened in your bar ticket. Mine was over the 4th of July weekend. We call it the July freakout. It happens to most people over the summer. It happens around now. We're recording this at the end of January. It happens around now for people who are taking the February exam. So what are your recommendations of how they can best utilize the tools to get past this point of feeling stuck and that they're not going to be prepared?
Yeah, the biggest thing is just take a deep breath for a moment and recognize that everybody goes through a plateau. When we are starting with our bar review process, a lot of us are starting with our first year subjects. So when I was studying for the bar exam, I hadn't thought about real property and future interests in 3 years, right? So when, it's at the beginning of bar prep and I'm refreshing my memory, then certainly I'm going to see my performance on multiple choice questions, which is what we typically start with in bar prep, start pretty low and then quickly grow as my memory is refreshed on these concepts that, I'm trying to wipe the cobwebs off. And so it's normal when we hit July or, late January for our February takers to hit a plateau to where Okay, well, we've gotten rid of all of those cobwebs. And so now we're not seeing as big of gains in our performance. And so that plateau's totally normal. So if that's what's happening to you, don't freak out. That's exactly what should be happening. And now what you're really doing is figuring out how you can get just small gains as you're focusing on the areas that aren't coming as quickly to you and that are a little bit more tricky. So first thing, deep breath, recognize this is normal. But also there might actually be an issue. And so think critically about that as well. I mean, if you're seeing a dramatic decline, for example, in your practice question percentages and things like that, then you have to take a step back and think about, well, why is that? So to use weightlifting to move away from our marathon training metaphor that we always use, if you're lifting weights, right, you're trying to learn how to squat and get to a 200-pound squat, let's say. It's really normal for people to plateau when they hit 150 pounds, let's pretend. And so, you can look at your nutrition. Maybe what you need to do is drop the weight that you've been lifting and do it in higher reps. Maybe it's that you need to do less reps with a higher weight, and that's how you're going to move past it. Maybe you need to try a different exercise, not just doing squats, but, try doing lunges. And those are different strategies that you can use to kind of get over that plateau. And it's an analogy that's applicable to bar prep too. I had my schlump, and I think for me, it just ended up being burnout. And really what I was doing is I was so focused on answering questions nonstop and constantly studying that my brain just went into a complete fog. And so for me, what I actually needed to do was just sit down and say, okay, you cannot study, for 16 hours a day. It is not healthy for you to be on your app answering multiple choice questions up until 2 a.m. You're just burnt out. And so what I needed to do was kind of rein back on my studying and make sure that I was giving myself some space to invest in my mental health, to, exercise, for example, to take a break to eat lunch so that my brain could continue to be actively engaged. And so I think to give some more practical advice to our listeners, if you're going through the plateau, take a deep breath. If you are identifying that there's a problem, then, this is a great time to start thinking about how you might change some of your strategies, talk to some friends and get advice on what they might be doing and things that might resonate for you and your practice a bit more.
Yeah. I think the only thing I'd add to that is to be very careful when you're in that plateau or in that freak out space of comparing how you're prepping to everybody else, because that game can get really messy when you talk to somebody who may be overconfident and is studying, wild hours. That may not be what you need. So I do think that if you really, I think burnout's a huge issue. So that's something that everybody needs to check in with themselves. But then go back to your kind of assessments, like we were talking about earlier, and say, like, okay, I'm plateauing, but am I seeing things dip? Am I just not, are the gains slowing, or am I not able to answer these questions? And I think that, if the answer is I'm not able to answer the questions, it's not just that I've plateaued, then it's time to put on the brakes and triage and come up with a different plan, because you may not be retaining information, or your flashcards may not be working for you, or, whatever it might be. So it's a great time to say, like, okay, let's take some honest looks at what's going well and what's not going well. And if you need to pivot, you still have time usually to pivot. But if you're just saying, like, oh, I'm plateauing and everyone else is at the library for 14 hours, it's possible. I had this conversation with my now husband when I said, like, but everybody's doing this. And he's like, you didn't study that way in law school. Like, why would you study that way now? And I was like, oh, that's a very good point. It's wise to have people who are not lawyers or have not studied for this test in your life to call you on silly comments that you may make out of anxiety. But I do think that going back to those assessments and asking yourself, like, I am putting in this study time. Do I have a recall of this information? One of the things I talk about with students a lot is, like, let's just talk about evidence. Can you list off all the hearsay exceptions and give me a simple rule statement for all of them? If the answer is no, then you need to look at how you're studying. Like, that's like kind of a baseline knowledge that's heavily tested. Everybody should have those skills. It doesn't have to be perfect, but you pretty much have to know that stuff. And so if you're not able to do that, then you need to put pause on and say, okay, now what do I do? Because I need to start learning the law in a different way and applying it to fact patterns to make sure that I can do the job and not just passively let the information wash over me, which feels great in the moment because you're like, oh, I'm so smart. I just am like letting the information, just watching these videos, and I've learned so much until I ask a very pointed question and somebody can't answer it.
Yeah, I love you bringing up the flashcard thing, because I think flashcards can be a really wonderful resource, or they can be an aggressively misused resource.
Yeah.
And I hear this a lot in our industry as flashcards being, an exercise of active learning, which is absolutely true. When you are in the process of creating flashcards and engaging with your learning materials, yes, active learning. But if then what you do with those flashcards is just read the front and flip and read the back, well, that's passive learning. And
Right.
so that's not an effective use of the flashcards. So just to go back to this example, if you're reflecting on your studying, you're going, well, I've made these outlines and I've made these flashcards, but I'm just not retaining the knowledge, then check and see and think, well, how are you actually engaging with those materials? If it's purely just reading, then think about talking about it out loud, getting a friend to quiz you on the flashcards so that you're not just flipping it over and passively reading it. Or I'm a whiteboard fan. And so, thank you, California, for implementing that. But for me, with flashcards, I would write out the answer on a whiteboard because just something about the mechanics of writing just helped with my memory retention. And so that was an effective way to utilize flashcards for me. And so, I love when we can have a positive environment of information sharing and different study practices and things like that, so that you can think of like, okay, well, maybe I'm not actually utilizing a flashcard in a meaningful way. And maybe somebody else has a better way of learning how to use that tool. So,
yeah. And I think with flashcards, you also run the risk of the legal trivia, right? Which can work a little bit better on an MBE question than it does on an essay. Because let's go back to my hearsay. My hearsay example is my favorite example. But if I go back to hearsay, it's like, it's cool if you can just, if I say, what's a dying declaration? I'm not going to test you. And, you can, unless you want to, rattle off the rule for that, right? And a California exception, even though I don't think you're licensed in California. I won't do that to you. But the idea is like, that's great legal trivia. You get an MBE question that's on a dying declaration, and it's great to just know that. But I think so often in the essays, you also need to know how the law is structured and fits together. You do need to be able to make a whole list of those hearsay exceptions, because you might get a fact pattern where you in your head need to be like, is it this? Is it this? Is it this? Is it this? That's the attack plan or checklist. Everybody's got a different name for it. But you don't want to lose kind of the forest through the trees. You need to understand how the law fits together so you can thoughtfully think through the law as you're issue spotting. And so I think that's another thing that often gets lost in the flashcard discussion, is that legal trivia is great, but you also need to understand how all that law fits together.
yeah, for sure. And we've seen that with just how students go through the MBE Q Bank, and now even in looking at some of the visuals in our lectures, because, I'm a flowchart person. And so for me, if we're using your hearsay example, yes, a dying declaration is but one hearsay exception, but it's really wonderful when you can use an image to just pull out and scope, right? And look at all of the hearsay exceptions. And even though California calls these hearsay exceptions, I'm going to use hearsay exclusions or non-hearsay.
It's fine. No judgment. We're just going to I know. I'm licensed in California, so.
Hey, they test the federal rules too, so.
They do. We have to know it all. We got to keep it fun over here.
So when I'm thinking of, okay, well, what is hearsay and how do I want to teach hearsay to one of our users? It's yes, I want to teach them all of those individual exceptions, but I also absolutely want to present them with this information in a way that shows how all of these pieces of the puzzle relate. So how do you identify when hearsay is an issue? Think about, okay, well, is this a statement that's being made outside of court, out of the current proceeding, right? and then think about, okay, well, who made the statement? And under what circumstances was that statement made? And if we're looking at hearsay exceptions, then why do these exceptions make sense? So that maybe we're not just relying on rote memorization, but also just using our own legal intuition, right? And so these hearsay exceptions are often turning around circumstances in which we should inherently be able to trust the truthfulness of the statement. So if somebody is dying and muttering, Lee is the one who stabbed me, well, chances are I'm telling the truth in the moment of my death that you are the one who stabbed me, right? So it seems logical that even though I might not be able to go and testify in court as to that statement, that perhaps that utterance should still be admissible because of the circumstances under which it was made. And
Yeah.
so there's a lot of tools that we can use to think about how we can present this information. And those are the kinds of things that as a content developer, I'm trying to show students not just the brick, but also the entire wall or the entire building and how they can piece this together.
Yeah. Well, we could talk about hearsay all day, but I'm going to have to move us along. I do love talking about hearsay. If you could go back to your bar self, the person you were when you were studying for the bar, what advice would you give yourself as a bar taker?
So this is funny. I knew you were going to ask this question. So I don't know how.
No.
But this perfectly touches on something that you had talked about earlier, which was to not get so caught up in what's going on with your peers around you. And so, for me in my bar prep experience, it was really important for me to understand that I could treat bar prep as a full-time job and not something that was, all encompassing and completely consuming my life. And when I was initially starting to study, what was really challenging for me was hearing from my peers, well, why didn't you delete your social media? What do you mean you've only gone through this percentage of the course? Well, why didn't you go and buy all of these additional supplemental products? We didn't see you in the library. And those criticisms were just not helpful for me. And so I very quickly learned that that's not what I needed to listen to, that I needed to surround myself with a positive peer group that was going to lift me up and encourage me and not compare, what they're doing to what I'm doing and to have a good support system. But the biggest thing was making sure that I was staying in tune with my own mental health and making sure that, yes, I'm able to get through my bar review materials. I'm staying on track with my course, but that I'm also not just panic answering questions, or just constantly. My poor husband had to listen to the bar review lectures playing in my car anytime we would drive somewhere because I was convinced that was wasted time and I had to make it beneficial in some way. Oh my goodness. And you know what? A 10-minute car ride to the grocery store was not going to make me fail the bar exam. And so give yourself permission. Please give yourself permission to treat bar prep like a full-time job. Do not let it consume your life and put reasonable parameters around your studying.
Yeah, I think that's a great point to finish up on. Well, we are unfortunately out of time. Thank you, Stephanie, for sharing your thoughts and your experience at UWorld and Themis and talking about what's coming down the pipe for the future. If students want to know more about Themis or UWorld, how do they do that?
Yeah, so you can certainly go online. We also like to give little snippets and sneak peeks about our resources on there. And so I think that's really cool. We have a free trial if you want to take a look at our MPE questions. And then with Themis Bar Review, we also have free law school essentials resources, a free MPRE course so that you can dip your toes in the water and see if our materials are something that resonate with you.
Awesome. I really encourage people to test out these products because that's the way you're going to feel confident investing in them. So I think that is great advice. Well, have a great rest of your day. Great rest of your bar season since we're still in the bar season. And I appreciate your time.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, Lee. Great talking to you.
I would like to take a moment to thank Themis Bar Review for sponsoring this. And remember, with our special promotion, you can access Themis's resources at an unbelievable value. Save $700 on any July 2025 Themis Bar Review course using the code BAREXAMTB700 at checkout. Now valid through April 1st, 2025. Thanks so much for watching. And be sure to subscribe, give us a like, and leave a comment if you have any questions. And to learn more, check out barexamtoolbox.com. Thanks for watching.